Asia Times has a very interesting and telling article entitled 77% of U.S. youth are unqualified for military service. U.S. military recruitment crises rooted in obesity, drug addiction, mental health issues, and low educational attainment. For insight into this, we are going to start today's show in a slightly different manner. We've got a different guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital: Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So the Asia Times reports the U.S. military faces an unprecedented recruitment crisis with health, education, political, and social challenges undermining the force's combat readiness against near-peer adversaries, including China. In March of 2023, American Military News reported that a 2020 Pentagon study revealed that 77% of young Americans do not qualify for military service without a waiver due to drug abuse, mental or physical problems, or being overweight. Dr. Horne, to me, this speaks to a number of issues impacting America, and the military recruitment crisis is the least of them. The nation has a piece. America's youth have a problem. Quote, according to a survey from Deloitte, around half of Generation Z and millennials are living paycheck to paycheck. A plurality work multiple jobs, and over a third say that they feel stressed all or most of the time. America's youth has a problem. And so, Dr. Horne, America is supposed to be the shining city on the hill. We're supposed to be the superpower. All of these ideologies, and our kids are fat, are stupid, and drug addicted. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, the stories are basically, as you suggest, an indictment of U.S. society and U.S. imperialism. If you start picking apart the analysis, you quickly come to the conclusion, for example, that you cannot separate this spate of obesity, which is disqualifying many of our youth, from this food system that is forced upon us, that is monumentally unhealthy, but at the same time helps to benefit these gigantic corporations. For example, Kraft, which turns out this version of cheese that a cow would vomit if he or she were able to see it. And so obesity cannot be separated away from the food crisis. With regard to education, well, obviously, you might have seen the Republican Party debate a few days ago where Uncle Tim Scott, who is running for president, basically pledged a war against the teachers union. And given the fact that from where I'm sitting in Texas, legislators are more interested in having armed guards at schools rather than well-paid teachers in schools, it's little accident that this leads to a crisis whereby students are not necessarily learning. Likewise, how can we deal with all of the maladies that afflict our youth, health and mental challenges not least, without analyzing the poor state of affairs when it comes to mental health care, when it comes to health care? With regard to the former, there's an epidemic of suicide amongst our youth, who obviously are rather dispirited and alienated by the future that they face, not to mention the fact that the proliferation of guns in this society, thanks to this strange interpretation of the Second Amendment and the fact that the right wing insists upon a proliferation of weapons, well, obviously that not only affects the number of youth who are able to be recruited, they're actually killing themselves, but it also bespeaks a crisis in terms of the society. And likewise, how can you talk about recruiting youth for the military when so many of our youth are on a fast track to prison? That is to say, the prison industrial complex. That is to say that the United States, by certain measures, still imprisons more of its citizenry than any other nation on planet Earth, which once again is difficult to separate from the profusion of white supremacy, which ensures that a disproportionate percentage of those prisoners happen to be of African ancestry. And similarly, we can talk about the fact that so many youth are not qualifying for the military, but then we should quickly raise this curious Supreme Court decision, which invalidated affirmative action with regard to youth of color in particular entering institutions of higher education, but had this gaping loophole with regard to continuing affirmative action at West Point, the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, the Air Force Academy at Colorado Springs. That kind of opportunism simultaneously is alienating too many of our youth because they recognize that the wind at their back is pushing them to go into the military rather than into a college or university, and they rail at that particular notion. And similarly, I don't think that you can talk about this story without looking at the scientific and technological innovations that these harebrained scientists are cooking up to deal with this crisis. You may be familiar with the movie RoboCop about this science fiction dystopia where cops are basically robots. Well, keep in mind that there is likely research in the United States that will lead to an army of robots, even though putatively that violates international law, just as we have drone warfare unfolding on the battlefields of Eastern Europe, not least because of the scientific and technological, quote, innovations, unquote, that have been unleashed by Uncle Sam. And similarly, we also need to realize that this present escapade in Ukraine, just referenced, it's difficult to separate that escapade where the United States is seeking to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian from the fact that the United States, increasingly, as this story suggests, is not able to recruit soldiers, even if they wanted to commit them to the battlefields of Ukraine. And similarly, I'm afraid to say that this story also points to another issue, which is that in recent years, the United States has encouraged a certain kind of immigration if the immigrants so targeted volunteer to go into the U.S. military. And so this, too, is rather troubling. This, too, is rather alienating. And obviously, what we're talking about is not a crisis necessarily of youth. We're talking about a crisis of U.S. imperialism.
I'm going to take something from this story and add it to another story that we have. So they say the protracted U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and this is interesting, followed by the disastrous 2021 U.S. withdrawal, as if the withdrawal was the problem and not the entrance into Afghanistan, may have engendered a sense of pessimism in the U.S. and public and policy-making circles, damaging U.S. society's perception of the U.S. military. It certainly sounds like they're talking about U.S. imperialism as being a significant problem. And add that to another story we have, Jake Sullivan and the unavoidable destruction of Western civilization, putting together people don't want to go into the military, but if you look at U.S. imperialism, how blatant it's been, how over the top it's been, even in recent years, particularly since the war on terror, the effect that that's had. Put that all together, your thoughts, Dr. Horne.
Well, an analyst or commentator more charitable than myself would probably have a scintilla of sympathy for Jake Sullivan. What I mean by that is, as we analyze the global scene, that is to say, the rise of China, the intractability of Russia when it comes to being unwilling, to put it mildly, to surrender to U.S. imperialism, Jake Sullivan faces a real challenge because what he's trying to do is recreate 1945, 1946, when the United States was striding the world like a colossus, where because of the sacrifice of the Soviet Union in the first instance, Nazi Germany was defeated, but then Germany itself was flat on its back. Japan, the other competitor, had been subjected to atomic bombing, from which it took a few years to recover. And that is the kind of nostalgia for the so-called good old days. That is to say, embodied and embedded in the slogan, "Make America Great Again," that Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, is trying to keep up with, is trying to replicate. But alas, that is a fool's errand. It's bound to end in tears. And the scurried and scattered U.S. evacuation from Afghanistan a few years ago in mid-August is symbolic of the kind of situation that Jake Sullivan has to deal with. And so now you see he is accompanying his supervisor, that is to say, Joseph R. Biden, to New Delhi and to Vietnam, raising Vietnam, where the United States seeks to tighten what it sees as an alliance with Vietnam in order to further encircle China. Obviously, it raises searching questions, which I'm not sure the media will deal with, about the futility and the rationale for the war on Vietnam, culminating ingloriously, like the war in Afghanistan, this time in 1975, with tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers in their graves. A memorial in Washington, D.C. helps to recollect or help us to recount their ultimate sacrifice. But of course, there's no memorial to the millions, perhaps, that perished in Vietnam. And so this connects to the previous story insofar as one does not have to be a historian to recognize that there is a penchant and proclivity for these masters of war in Washington to commit the flower of youth to failing bloody missions by which they come back home in body bags. And to top it all off, you have these nincompoops like Jake Sullivan, then continually promoted, failing upwards until they reach the next catastrophe. Is there little wonder why our youth do not want to commit to a system like that?
I want to clarify or follow up on two things and then get to the next story. One is you mentioned Kraft creating cheese that would make cows vomit. It's very interesting that you said that because a number of years ago, I was in the grocery store buying some cold cuts and whatnot, and I saw on a package of Kraft cheese sliced singles, it didn't say cheese, it said cheese food. And so I wondered, what in the world is what's the difference between? So I finally found out that cheese food is only 50% cheese and it's 50% other ingredients. So just so people will have a clarity on what you meant when you said that. And the other thing, when we look at 77% of American students not being fit for military service, this might be a bit facetious, but I think that reality provides clarity about why we'll fight in Ukraine till the last Ukrainian dies and why we're looking for ECOWAS to go into Niger because we don't have the soldiers to do it. With all that being said, Pepe Escobar has a piece in Press TV, Iran's induction into BRICS group, a masterstroke of diplomacy. And Pepe Escobar, he talks about how Russia and China brought Iran into the Shanghai Security Organization, and then through bringing them into the Shanghai Security Organization, they were then able to very simply move Iran into BRICS. And your thoughts on this broader strategy as we move from a unipolar to a multipolar world?
Well, that story featuring Pepe Escobar is well taken, but let me also make a footnote to our food story. You may want to reference the fact that when the former U.S. President, William Jefferson Clinton, was conducting his affair at the White House with Monica Lewinsky, he only stopped to take a call from a sugar lobby, who, of course, was a major donor to his electoral fortunes. And you cannot separate this obesity epidemic, which is afflicting our youth, from the proliferation of sugar. If you once again look at the food labels, you'll find fructose, a form of sugar, in virtually everything, including vitamins, believe it or not. People buy vitamins in order to stay healthy, not reading the label, recognize they're having a dose of sugar. Now, with regard to the story concerning Iran, we should pay careful and close attention to U.S. relations with Iran right now. I say that not only because the U.S. Navy is harassing its Iranian counterparts right now as we speak in the Persian Gulf, but also the United States is still seeking to encircle Iran, this time by having some sort of entente between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which then they will try to flip Saudi Arabia out of its entente that Pepe Escobar mentions with Iran and bring it back into the fold of Uncle Sam. Now, I don't think that will necessarily work. One, I don't think it necessarily will be to the material interests of Saudi Arabia, which is now joined with the hip with Iran in BRICS, which, of course, was a diplomatic masterstroke, helping to forestall this further and future encirclement of Iran. But secondly, Iran and Saudi Arabia have an interest in making sure that the price of a barrel of oil does not fall precipitously, generating revenue, particularly for Iran, so that it can help to confront many pressing domestic problems. And so, once again, we see the spectacle of President Joseph R. Biden in New Delhi seeking to weld various alliances against Russia, against China, against Iran. Obviously, he slept through the course on Diplomacy 101, where it suggests that you take on one superpower at a time. And certainly you don't take on two superpowers and a superpower in waiting, speaking of Russia, China, and Iran, because all you do is force them into an overarching alliance targeting yourself. Mr. Biden really needs a refresher course.
And we've got just about a minute left. Kissinger lied. U.S. CIA orchestrated 73 Chile coup. We got 1 minute.
Well, this is a story that hits home. I'm not as young as I look. And believe it or not, I was in Chile before September 11th, 1973, when a U.S.-sponsored coup d'etat by the Chilean military was engineered. I was well aware of the U.S. interference in the internal affairs of that socialist-oriented regime led by Salvador Allende. I knew that months before that coup, that President Fidel Castro himself, believe it or not, has spent about 3 weeks in Chile, counseling the comrades there, seeking to forestall the coup that we all knew was coming. And likewise, the idea that Washington would make the Chilean economy scream is still their strategy that they're now seeking to export to Iran, to Zimbabwe, and other points too numerous to mention.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate that analysis. Enjoy your weekend, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.